So Liverpool and Manchester had at least built the road, but yet there was a question that got brought up. Who would take that raw cotton and maybe passengers? Well, they did consider stationary engines and, of course, at least horses and wagons, but yet they settled on locomotives. But what locomotives? They did have locomotives, but yet they wanted the best of the best. So, the Liverpool and Manchester held a trial. The Rainhill Trials. The Rainhill Trials was a set of trials for locomotives, whereas it was advertised around the land for the engineers to build locomotives for the competition. Not only the winner will win a £500 prize, which is the equivalent of about £68,793 and .02 in today's money, but yet in US dollars, that's about 87,336 and 87 cents. That 87 cents is quite tempting. For the trials itself, they have to do 70 miles, the equivalent of going from Liverpool to Manchester and back. So that they had to do 70 miles. For that, 10 people entered, but yet unfortunately only 5 showed up. Let's go first with the wackiest, that being the Cyclopede. It's quite literally just a horse on a treadmill. And yet, it did not really participate, since technically it's not a steam engine, so which it was disqualified. But it was used during the Rainhill Trials to entertain the crowd. But yet, let's get on to the serious contenders. Perseverance. I want to get this out of the way just because of how kind of unique and kind of how obscure this is. Unlike with the other engines in the Rainhill Trials, Perseverance is the only one that's kind of mysteriously unknown. Since, like, if you look up here, like in the, like, Perseverance, like, locomotive, it's just that, like, let me do it right now. Let me, like, if you look it up, you get all the same results. You get this, a 040, but yet, it's not actually that. Since it might actually be a lot more different. Since this might be not what it looks like. Since people don't really know what it actually looked like. It's really shrouded in mystery, and yet, even though it did not win it, it was like not only the lightest of which, but also yet the oldest builder. In which he did persist of at least wanting to have locomotives run on the railway right after the victory. So due to that, even in which the name really lived up to its builder, which is kind of neat. And yet I will say that this engine looks kind of cute. And yet the next one was Novelty. Was a great competitor. Not only had high speed, but also was able to outperform many of the engines. Unfortunately, it broke down due to the bellows blew. Novelty broke down and never completed the 70 miles. Soon we got Sans-Pareil, a great big boiler on wheels. Sans-Pareil is quite of a unique one, since it was quickly built together, since the creator built it in his spare time. And due to this, the engine broke down several times, and yet, due to this, we got our final competitor. That being from the son of George Stephenson, here we introduce Robert Stephenson. George Stephenson tasked his son to build a locomotive for the trials. After George Stephenson's locomotive, Locomotion number 1, he tasked his son to build a locomotive to enter into the trials. And yet, boy, Locomotion must run in his family because the Rocket was the most perfect, if not one of the greatest engines of its time. The Rocket practically wiped out the competition. Unlike with the other locomotives where they all broke down, like for example, Perseverance, when she was being traveled from Scotland, she fell off the wagons since she was being carried by horse and wagons, fell and completely got broken. Thankfully, at least, the judges gave them more time, but yet, she failed. But yet, the Rocket was able to at least go last long and even perform and outcompete, and even was extremely nuanced in the case. Not only with its multi-flue tubes to allow more water to be heated up, but also yet pull 3 times its own weight, but also yet it became the crowd's favorite. And whenever one of the other engines broke down, Rocket was sent out to entertain the crowd, and yet the rocket had won. By the third day, all the engines were completely wiped out. They all had broken down, and yet Rocket was the only one standing. Rocket quite literally left them all for dead. After the trials, the Stephensons had won the contract and the prize. So they built 9 locomotives for the railway. They built a special coach for the Duke of Wellington, and yet people at least gather around to see the first train making its journey from Liverpool to Manchester. Unfortunately, there was a tragic tale in this. The Northumbrian at least had made a stop to at least go and refuel. Everyone got out of the train just to stretch their legs, and they watched as they saw Rocket at least coming towards them. And yet, this was a 2-lane track, and yet unfortunately, Rocket was coming at them fast. Everyone quickly got on board, all except for one, William Huskerson. His leg was crushed underneath Rocket's wheels. He was attended by a doctor and quickly at least rushed back to the hospital, but unfortunately he did not make it. Even though it took him a life, and yet some people think that might be the end of railways, but it did not. In fact, it just seemed that the railway grew, not because of the accident. The Liverpool-Manchester Railway had proven itself to be extremely successful, not only account for the fact of at least tons of content being transported from Liverpool to Manchester and back in less than like a day. And yet there was so much cotton being imported, and thus the railways grew in popularity. And not even just Liverpool and Manchester. All around the country, places have been integrating their own railways. The Stephensons were not quite done, and yet the Rocket's still around today. In fact, here's the current image of him. And yet, why does it look so different? It was because the Rocket went through many modifications. As with many engines tend to change or kind of differ over time, and yet those changes are from the creators. The Stephensons had proved themselves to be the fathers of the railways, but yet they were not quite done. In 1830, they at least unveiled the Planet. The Planet was quite literally the final stage of the locomotive. They went from boilers with gears and can only move 5 miles per hour to now have gotten itself matured. The Planet laid down the blueprint for every single steam locomotive after. The Planet had at least introduced many key designs that will be present in steam locomotives for the next 200 years. Those being a frame. Many engines before this used the boiler as the frame. After the Planet, the boiler no longer became the frame. Instead, they had their own little custom frame, in which the Planet uses a sandwich frame, which is kind of a little bit funny. It's 2 metal pieces and a wood in the middle, but also yet it has its smoke box and a firebox. And yet, these were ways to at least separate coal and ash from one another, just so it's not all in one place, separating them, which becomes a key part of every single locomotive after this has a smoke box and a firebox. Most, at least. As Chris Berry puts it,
the Planet had led the way into the future. The railway era had begun, and it would make the world a very different place.
The Rainhill Trials was extremely important. It had proven that trains can be the way to travel.